Let me call the September 1st, 2020 meeting of the Planning Commission to order. First item is, let's call the roll.
Mr. Buchert,
Present.
Mr. Rickelman,
Here.
Mr. Shanahan,
Present.
Mrs. Jerome,
I don't see her in the picture.
Yeah, you can show her present when she reappears on the screen.
Okay.
Mr. Allred,
Here.
Let's go to item 3A, the first item for any action, which is text amendment TXT 20-02 to Chapter 23 Land Development Code, Stillwater City Code, Chapter 23, Land Development Code, Article 5, use categories, limitations, Division 1, generally Section 23-96, definitions. The material of the staff for their presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Planning Commission, Ryan Harkins, Community Development. This is a text amendment that is coming before you after discussions with some different developers about some various commercial properties and potential redevelopment options. In the midst of those discussions over the spring and early summer months, staff, as they were looking at the code and different ways to do things and create opportunities and help facilitate opportunities for redevelopment on commercial land, we noticed some varying definitions that were missing from the code. And so this is just a general type of cleanup scenario. And the text amendment is essentially designed to help provide some additional definitions that help, we hope, provide clarity. This is one of the small steps that we'll be bringing to help provide some additional clarity into the current code while staff works on a longer term code update possibility that we hope to bring forward to you in the next 6 to 12 months. Having said that, right now, again, this is about definitions in the development code, and as that, again, some redevelopment options and potential opportunities, it became clear to staff that we needed to do some better clarification and differentiating between various uses. And one of the ways to do that is through definitions. And so we've included some definitions for accommodation, including some apartment-like hotels, and trying to separate out general accommodation from short-term rentals, from accessory dwellings, as well as Greek housing and dormitories. We added a definition for that. We added a definition of student housing. We added a definition of dormitory, because those were not in the current development code. We also added definitions for single family, two family, and multiple family dwelling. Actually are not existent. We also added a definition of family. And right now that's another one that's not in the code. So we were, again, trying to help provide some clarification going forward. So those are some varying definitions. They're basic ones in most development codes. I think probably what happened previously is we were finding ways to make it work based on some assumptions of what definitions would be, but just to help clarify things going forward, staff feels it's appropriate at this time to start formalizing what those definitions might be. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Does the Planning Commission have any questions?
I had a question. Occasionally we've had various decisions we made where they would talk about the city code doesn't have a boarding house regulation. We don't have a setting for boarding houses, and that somehow we couldn't let this house turn into this or that. I noticed in the list, it doesn't have the boarding house listed as a definition. I know that doesn't define and make it so, but would it be helpful to have something like that defined, since that's sometimes decided as why we can't do certain things? So that was my question.
Okay. So that is one possibility that we could look at. Either amending, you could make that as a recommendation going forward to council, and we could add that, or we could come back as a separate text amendment. and add it.
Let me jump in here. Vicky, are you present? Can you speak to us? I have you as muted.
Mr. Chairman, if I may,
Yes.
Vicky has sent a chat to all of us indicating that she's not getting any sound, but she is here with audio. If that makes any sense. In case you didn't see that.
Okay, I just see that I can't hear anyone again from her. So, Ryan, let's go back to you.
Okay, sure. So we can add that for this text amendment, or we can come back with a separate one depending on the pleasure of the Planning Commission. As I mentioned, we're trying to also look at a broader code update, so we can add that definition in there. It's probably one of those, as staff was looking at originally this text amendment, the thought was probably, we think some of these others might help clarify things enough that we might be able to not need that. But that's one, probably it's a little bit more the historical issue than what most of the staff here knows now. So that's something we can definitely revisit.
I have a question in terms of the definition of a family. So under that definition, I read that one of the definitions is 3 unrelated people, or 2 unrelated people and any children related to either of them. Does that mean if you've got a single family zoned property, you have a 4-bedroom house, and you rent to OSU students, you could only rent that to 3 students under this definition?
It could go to that direction. I think part of what staff was looking at originally was the idea of, we've heard a number of complaints from various sections of the community where a person would tear down a single family, an older single family home, put up a new structure with 8 bedrooms and 1 kitchen and say it's single family, and then buy the room and say, well, it's single family, but I'm renting it, and with a large concrete parking lot in the front, and almost no backyard, and then having the neighborhood complain about all of the people in one building that's single family, as well as a sea of concrete in the front with a lot of stormwater runoff. And so I think the definition at the time, as we were compiling this text amendment, was designed to help deal with that issue.
Mr. Dorman, is that a legitimate way of doing this, to limit it to 3? I've been in several hearings where we've done this, where someone's torn down and built 5, 6, 7, 8 bedrooms in single family. Is this a legal defensible way of reducing that to 3?
It's one way. It's not necessarily, I can't sit here and tell you that it's absolutely legally defensible. I have seen other university cities use a definition somewhat like this. I've also seen them use other definitions. And just as I mentioned to Ryan this afternoon, the definition of what constitutes a family, that's very unsettled. And so I think that you probably have had some experience with with the Westwood overlay, for example. We got into the definition of family there, and that definition actually evolves over time because of the way we amortize those uses. And so I don't know that using this definition in this way is necessarily going to solve that problem. And so I don't know. I can tell you that it is a way, but it's not necessarily the only way to address this.
How do we come up with the number 3 versus 4?
So that definition is very similar to some other college towns, particularly in the Big 12, like Ames, for example, which is Iowa State. So it's tailored very similar to their definition of family. And we can certainly propose, you could approve this as amended and go with 4 instead of 3 if you feel like that's a number that's something that's more defensible. And it would be similar to essentially a 4-bedroom apartment being shared then.
Do any other commissioners have any other questions?
Well, I just had a comment on that number of 3. I know in the early part of this century, when there were 2 ordinances before the city trying to limit the number of students in single-family neighborhoods, the number 3 in terms of unrelated people was used. So I don't know if that's a historical precedence is in terms of a starting point for discussion or not. It's just a point of information.
Thank you for that comment. Any other questions? Let me
So,
go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I want to be thoughtful and deliberate on that specific language. Is it possible that we are creating a future problem by limiting that to just 3? If I'm understanding the discussion that we've just had. And maybe
My
I'm not.
thought is this. My thought is we need to open the public hearing, hear from the public if anybody from the public is on here, then close the public hearing, and then I think we need to have an open and honest discussion in this area. So I just like to hear from the public, if any of the public, before we get into that discussion, is my opinion. Are there any objections to that? Not hearing any objections, let me open up the public hearing. Is there anybody that would like to speak on this item? Is there anybody that would like to speak on this item? Not hearing or seeing anyone, I will close the public hearing. And now the staff, if you'll go over the recommendations, and then we'll start our discussion.
Absolutely. So right now, the current development code has a lack of text that can lead to some assumptions. And a text amendment we feel is necessary to help further clarify some individual uses. Lance Gross did do some checking. There is a definition of boarding within the development code, and I'll share that in a moment. In terms of alternatives, you can accept the findings and recommend the proposed text amendment as presented. You can find the text amendment is appropriate with some amendments and approve or recommend approval as amended. You can find it's not necessary and recommend denial or not recommend approval. You can also find additional discussion is needed and table the item to a date certain and request additional information or other things as appropriate. Having said that, in terms of current code, right now the ordinance has boarding rooming houses as a building where, for compensation or by prearrangement for definite periods, sleeping in living quarters provided to 4 or more unrelated people. And I would emphasize, to go back to the idea of Westwood, they have a definition of family in that zoning overlay that is unique to Westwood. This change, or this proposed definition, would not take that away. It would not supersede it. When we look at Westwood, that definition would apply to that overlay. So just to help further clarify things.
Any other questions of the staff?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So I think an update to this language is fantastic. I think this can only help. Certainly, we want to be thoughtful and deliberate in how we use this language. So, Mr. Dorman, I'd like to ask you, if you don't mind, do you foresee any potential issues or legal problems that may arise by that particular language, if that makes any sense?
Sorry, I had to unmute. It's hard to predict, but in the past, when we have messed with this language, in fact, the boarding house ordinance or language that Ryan just mentioned, when we tinkered with that language, it engendered a lot of public discussion. So I think whatever you do will create that. Also, I would say that there are arrangements in the city that probably exceed 3 persons living in a single family residence right now who are unrelated, and it will impact those legal relationships. So it's entirely possible that the city will have to address that in one form or another. I mean, there are ways to do that. In Westwood, we went through an amortization process. In some places, grandfather these pre-existing type uses, or some places just go in and start enforcing it. And so I'm not a good predictor of whether we're going to get sued or not. I'm usually wrong. So, but it will. I think it will engender a lot of public comment as this thing moves forward.
I think what's important, as you being the city attorney, is you're not saying this is a slam dunk, we're going to lose in court, you shouldn't be moving forward with this, nor you're saying that it's definitely going to be held up in court, but you're saying you're okay with it moving forward in this form.
It's a gray area. And as I said earlier, I know a lot of city attorneys from a lot of other college towns, and they all wrestle with this same issue. And there are as many answers to this question as there are college towns. Everybody has their own unique way of addressing it. And you have to figure out what's going to work here. But it's not an area of settled law by any stretch. And so, I mean, I'm not going to say or tell you it's illegal, but I'm not going to say or tell you that this is ironclad, that you're not going to have any problem going forward with this.
So Ryan, did I hear that a boarding house has the number 4 in it?
That is correct. It describes a house. Boarding rooming house is a building where, again, for compensation and by prearrangement for definite periods, sleeping in living quarters provided to 4 or more unrelated people. So if you wanted to potentially amend that definition to be 4 unrelated, then you would essentially have a situation where 4 or more would be boarding house situation, 4 or less could be more of the family definition. Whether or not you would still get challenged, that's, again, as Mr. Rose said, very different.
Is a boarding house, can it be in a single family zoned area?
Yes.
Yeah.
There are instances, in fact, we use the boarding house ordinance to address some of these issues with large numbers of people inhabiting a single family residence in the past. So I guess I would make this comment. If the intent of this ordinance is to go in and clarify a few things and so that we can move forward to the next incarnation of the land development code, trying to define family and trying to define boarding house is probably a much larger issue than this was intended to address. And maybe the answer is to maybe not move forward with that definition or the boarding house issue yet until you're able to address it on a larger scale. Because I would submit to you that you will see this again because having gone through it at least twice in the past, I can tell you that there's a lot of interest in this, and it is an industry that you're talking about regulating when you start regulating the size of rent houses and redefining what a boarding house is. The other thing that is not addressed here in this definition is that for example, in the Westwood situation, that ordinance has minimum sizes for rooms and things like that. So there's a number of things that have to be in place before you just arbitrarily come up with a number of unrelated individuals that can reside in a single family house.
My mind is leaning towards, I don't have a problem with any other definition except the definition of family. And I don't know really what direction to go with that. And Mr. Dorman has suggested maybe we want to move forward with all the definitions and leave that family to a later date. Number one. Number two is we're in the middle of this pandemic. We're on our site right here. I'd like to wait until we can meet in person in the council room in a few months and have a public meeting and have people there before we get into the definition of family. That's my thought.
I agree with Mike. I think the chairman. Sorry. I think there needs, I think there needs.
You can call me Mike.
Okay. I think there needs to be a more public discussion about this issue. It will be somewhat acrimonious, but I think it's required and needed.
Any other comments?
Well, I mean, I'm amenable to taking the definitions other than the family and going to a future point. And obviously, we do need to have a discussion on that. But from my discussion, since the 3-2 sized house is the most common house being built, particularly new houses today, 3-bedroom, bath, and the people who come to me and citizens who are upset about mom and dad buy the house, their kid takes the master and has 2 friends in the house with them. That's very common in our residential neighborhoods, particularly our nicer neighborhoods, newer neighborhoods. That is an issue that many people are very upset about. They don't like it. They don't like the situation. So I think this issue about what constitutes it, when you start talking about number of unrelated people and all that, there's always things. I think a broader discussion has to be done where, the first parts of that boarding house talks about, right? There's agreement, financial or otherwise types of things. And then it talks about number 4 people and all that. The first part is, to me, much stronger, is that you're having a business transaction going on in some way, shape, or form, as opposed to the number of unrelated individuals. We have someone in a polyamorous relationship and they think that they're a family and we're defining them not as a family kind of a thing. I don't want to get into those, but certainly not in this scope. So I'm with you, Mike. Chairman Mike, how about that? That I would be amenable to accepting all the other definitions and strike family for now, with the belief that we've got to come back to this topic, and acrimonious or not, and I agree, Mike, not chair, that it probably will not, that it will be, but we need to come back to the discussion in some way. It's got to be an issue that residents are very interested in, and obviously business owners that own rental properties are going to be very well too. So it's got to be brought up in some way. And defining
So
something.
Brad, why don't you make a
definitions.
motion to that effect? Then if
Then,
we got a second, then we have more discussion if people want more discussion.
then I will move that the ordinance definitions accepting family be accepted as presented.
Do I hear a second?
Second.
Vicky, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. I couldn't hear you for the first half of the meeting, so my
Oh.
apologies. I can hear you now.
So you're present. And so when we call the roll for the vote, we'll call your name. Is there more discussion on this particular item? Not hearing any more discussion, let me call for the vote.
Mr. Buchert,
Yes.
Mr. Rickelman,
Yes.
Mr. Shanahan,
Yes.
Mrs. Jerome,
Yes.
Mr. Allred.
Yes.
Motion passes. Let's go to item 4A, meeting summary for review and possible action of August 18th, 2020. Are there any corrections, or do I hear a motion?
I move we accept the minutes as presented.
Second.
Motion a second? Let me call for the vote.
Mr. Buchert,
Yes.
Mr. Rickelman,
Yes.
Mr. Shanahan,
Yes.
Mrs. Jerome,
Yes.
Mr. Allred.
Yes.
Motion passes. The next planning commission meeting is September 15th, 2020. Do you hear a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Motion a second. Let's call the vote.
Mr. Buchert,
Yes.
Mr. Rickelman,
Yes.
Mr. Shanahan,
Yes.
Mrs. Jerome,
Yes.
Mr. Allred.
Yes.
Motion passes. We're adjourned. Thank you very much.